On May 13, 1888, Brazilian Princess Isabel of Bragança signed Imperial Law number 3353. Although it contained just 18 words, it is one of the most important pieces of legislation in Brazilian history. Called the Golden Law, it abolished slavery in all its forms. Slavery in Brazil began long before the first Portuguese settlement was established in 1516, with members of one tribe enslaving captured members of another. Later, colonists were heavily dependent on indigenous labor during the initial phases of settlement to maintain the subsistence economy, and natives were often captured by expeditions of bandeirantes. The bandeirantes are descendants of first and second generation Portuguese who were slavers, explorers, adventurers, and fortune hunters in early colonial Brazil. They are largely responsible for Brazil's great expansion westward, far beyond the Tordesillas Line of 1494, by which Pope Alexander VI divided the new continent into a western Castilian section and an eastern Portuguese section. Bandeirantes came from a wide spectrum of backgrounds, including plantation owners, traders, and members of the military, as well as people of mixed ancestry and previously captured Indian slaves. The main focus of the Bandeirantes missions was to capture and enslave native populations. They carried this out by a number of tactics. The Bandeirantes usually relied on surprise attacks, simply raiding villages or collections of natives, killing any who resisted, and kidnapping the survivors. Trickery could also be used. One common tactic was disguising themselves as Jesuits, often singing Mass to lure the natives out of their settlements. At the time, the Jesuits had a deserved reputation as the only colonial force that treated the natives somewhat fairly in the Jesuit reductions of the region. If luring the natives with promises did not work, the Bandeirantes would surround the settlements and set them alight, forcing inhabitants out into the open. Bandeirantes frequently targeted Jesuit missions, capturing thousands of natives from them in the early 1600s. Beyond the capture of new slaves and recapture of runaways, Bandeirantes could also act as large quasi-military forces tasked with exterminating native populations who refused to be subjected to rule by the Portuguese. They also were always on the lookout for precious metals like gold and silver. As evident through an account of one of Ignacio Correa Pamplona's expeditions, Bandeirantes liked to think of themselves as brave civilizers who tamed the wildness of the frontier by exterminating native populations and providing land for settlers. They could be compensated heavily by the crown for their efforts. Pamplona was, for example, rewarded with land grants. In 1629, Antonio Raposo Tavares had led a bandera composed of 2,000 allied natives, 900 Mamelucos, that is, a Portuguese word that denotes the first-generation child of a European and an Amerindian, and 69 whites, to find precious metals and stones and to capture Indians for slavery. This expedition alone was responsible for the enslavement of over 60,000 indigenous people. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that indigenous slavery alone would not meet the needs of sugar plantation labor demands. For one thing, life expectancy for Native American slaves was very low. Overwork and disease decimated native populations. Furthermore, Native Americans were familiar with the land, meaning they had the incentive and ability to escape from their slave owners. For these reasons, starting in the 1570s, African slaves became the labor force of choice on the sugar plantations. Welcome to yet another video segment. Today we are taking a solemn dive at yet another grim event on one of the dark chapters of the slave era, the untold horrors of Brazil's history with slavery. Here we are going to explore the devastating, harrowing experiences of enslaved Africans in their overwhelmingly untellable mass. Sit tight as we unfold to your viewing discretion this dark chapter of our eye-opening black narrative. Don't forget to support our efforts by liking the video and subscribing if you are yet to. The Portuguese became involved with the African slave trade first during the Reconquista, or reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, mainly through the mediation of the Alfaqueque, the person tasked with the rescue of Portuguese captives, slaves, and prisoners of war. And then later in 1441, long before the colonization of Brazil, but now as slave traders. Slaves exported from Africa during this initial period of the Portuguese slave trade primarily came from Mauritania, and later the Upper Guinea coast. Scholars estimate that as many as 156,000 slaves were exported from 1441 to 1521 to Iberia and the Atlantic islands from the African coast. The trade made the shift from Europe to the Americas as a primary destination for slaves around 1518. Prior to this time, slaves were required to pass through Portugal to be taxed before making their way to the Americas. Long before Europeans came to Brazil and began colonization, indigenous groups such as the Papanacis, the Guayanases, the Tupinambás, and the Caduayas enslaved captured members of other tribes. The captured lived and worked with their new communities as trophies to the tribe's martial prowess. Some enslaved would eventually escape, but could never reattain their previous status in their own tribe because of the strong social stigma against slavery and rival tribes. During their time in the new tribe, enslaved indigents would even marry as a sign of acceptance and servitude. For the enslaved of cannibalistic tribes, execution or cannibalistic ceremonies for devouring purposes could happen at any moment. Such reported actions of cannibalism and intertribal ransom were used to justify the enslavement of Native Americans throughout the colonial period. The Portuguese were seen as fighting a just war when enslaving indigenous populations, supposedly rescuing them from their own cruelty. And how do you rescue people from their own cruelty? By being cruel. This focus on pre-colonial enslavement has been criticized as it flies in the face of the reality that Portuguese enslavement of Amerindians, and later Africans, was practiced at a much larger scale than prior local enslavement practices. The importation of African slaves began midway through the 16th century, but the enslavement of indigenous peoples continued well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Enslaved individuals endured extreme physical and psychological abuse. The grueling labor in sugarcane plantations, mines, and other harsh environments subjected them to inhumane conditions. Floggings, sexual violence, and family separations were rampant, disrupting and tearing apart the fabric of communities. In the first 250 years after the colonization of the land, roughly 70% of all immigrants to the colony were enslaved people. Indigenous slaves remained much cheaper during this time than their African counterparts, though they did suffer horrendous death rates from European diseases. Although the average African slave lived to only be 23 years old because of terrible work conditions, this was still about 4 years longer than indigenous slaves, which was a big contribution to the high price of African slaves. African slaves were also more desirable due to their experience working in sugar plantations. In a particular mill in São Vicente in the 1540s, for example, African slaves were said to have held all the most skilled positions, including the crucial role of sugar master, even though they were vastly outnumbered by native slaves at the time. It is impossible to pinpoint when the first African slaves arrived in Brazil, but estimates range anywhere in the 1530s. Regardless, African slavery was established at least by 1549, when the first governor of Brazil, Tom de Souza, arrived with slaves sent from the king himself. During the Atlantic slave trade era, Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other country in the world. Brazil was the world's leading sugar exporter during the 17th century. From 1600 to 1650, sugar accounted for 95% of Brazil's exports, and slave labor was relied heavily upon to provide the workforce to maintain these export earnings. It is estimated that 560,000 Central African slaves arrived in Brazil during the 17th century, in addition to the indigenous slave labor that was provided by the bandeiras. The appearance of slavery in Brazil dramatically changed with the discovery of gold and diamond deposits in the mountains of Minas Gerais in the 1690s. Slaves started being imported from Central Africa and the Mina coast to mining camps in enormous numbers. Over the next century, the population boomed from immigration, and Rio de Janeiro exploded as a global export center. Urban slavery in new city centers like Rio, Recife, and Salvador also heightened demand for slaves. Transportation systems for moving wealth were developed, and cattle ranching and foodstuff production expanded after the decline of the mining industries in the second half of the 18th century. Between 1700 and 1800, 1.7 million slaves were brought to Brazil from Africa to make this sweeping growth possible. Brazil's foundation was built on the exploitation and enslavement of indigenous peoples and black Africans. Out of the 12 million Africans who were forcibly brought to the New World, approximately 5.5 million were brought to Brazil between 1540 and the 1860s. The mass enslavement of Africans played a pivotal role in the country's economy and was responsible for the production of vast amounts of wealth. The inhumane treatment and forced labor of enslaved Africans remains a significant part of Brazil's history and its ongoing struggle with systemic racism. Until the early 1850s, most enslaved African people who arrived on Brazilian shores were forced to embark at West Central African ports, especially in Luanda, present-day Angola. Slave labor was the driving force behind the growth of the sugar economy in Brazil, and sugar was the primary export of the colony from 1600 to 1650. Gold and diamond deposits were discovered in Brazil in 1690, which sparked an increase in the importation of enslaved African people to power this newly profitable mining. Transportation systems were developed for the mining infrastructure, and the population boomed from immigrants seeking to take part in gold and diamond mining. Demand for enslaved Africans did not wane after the decline of the mining industry in the second half of the 18th century. Cattle ranching and foodstuff production proliferated after the population growth, both of which relied heavily on slave labor. 1.7 million slaves were imported to Brazil from Africa from 1700 to 1800, and the rise of coffee in the 1830s further expanded the Atlantic slave trade. Plantations, particularly in the sugar and coffee industries, were sites of extreme exploitation, with enslaved people facing grueling work conditions. Plantation owners wielded unchecked power, treating slaves as mere property devoid of basic human rights. The sheer magnitude of this dehumanization is encapsulated in the degrading living conditions, where overcrowded and unsanitary quarters facilitated the speedy spread of diseases. The mortality rates were staggering, underscoring the expendability of human lives in the pursuit of economic gain. The psychological trauma inflicted upon generations of enslaved black individuals is immeasurable. Stripped of cultural identity, forbidden from practicing their traditions, denied education and rights, they faced a relentless assault on their humanity. Women, in particular, faced sexual exploitation, adding another layer of anguish to their experience. Practices such as branding and its excruciating procedure reinforced all the more the dehumanizing nature of slavery. The impact of slavery on Afro-Brazilians persists today, evident in systemic racism, economic disparities, and social inequalities. For 350 years, slavery was the heart of the Brazilian economy. According to historian Emilia Viotti da Costa, 40% of the 10 million enslaved Africans brought to the New World ended up in Brazil. Enslaved persons were so pivotal to the economy that Ina von Binzer, a German educator who lived in Brazil in the late 1800s, wrote, "In this country, the blacks occupy the main role. They are responsible for all the labor and produce all the wealth in this land. The white Brazilian just doesn't work." By the mid-16th century, the Portuguese were importing enslaved Africans in substantial numbers to work in new, permanent sugar colonies. Years before the North American slave trade got underway, more enslaved people had been brought to Brazil than would ever reach British North America. The Brazilian slave trade would continue for another nearly 200 years. Brazil's history with slavery is deeply marked by countless harrowing tales of cruelty and profound suffering of countless black individuals. Some managed to survive with memories of the untellable experiences of slavery bleeding forever all through the remainder of their lives, while others did not survive the inhumanity meted to them by the cold hands of their masters. Throughout Brazil, numerous methods of punishment were used by slave owners to discipline their slaves. Typically on large plantations, the power to enforce punishment was granted to an overseer, who was responsible for watching slaves while they worked. However, the most common form of punishment was whipping. Depending on the severity of the crime or offense, slaves would receive a specific number of lashings, typically ranging from 100 to 300. In some cases, after being whipped, the flesh would then be cut and sprinkled with pepper and salt to increase the pain. One particularly chilling episode, buttressing the untellable depths of the cruelty meted out on African slaves, is the story of Maria Carolina, an enslaved woman in the 19th century. In the year 1835, she dared to write a letter to her husband, who was also enslaved on a different plantation. Discovered by her master, Maria Carolina faced brutal consequences. Not only was she severely scourged until she bled through her entire skin, but her master also ordered her right hand to be amputated as a grotesque punishment for her attempted communication. Yet another poignant episode occurred during the 19th century, when a young slave named João endured unimaginable suffering on a sugar plantation in Bahia. João attempted a daring escape after witnessing his family being torn apart through brutal separations. On the run, João faced a relentless pursuit by merciless overseers. His tale unveils the pervasive brutality, with instances of slaves being punished for attempting to preserve their familial bonds. Yo's heart-wrenching journey highlights not only the physical torment, but also the psychological trauma inflicted upon individuals striving for freedom. The story of Mahama Gardo Bakwakwa, a former slave taken from the Niger Delta in Africa, sold into slavery in Brazil, and ultimately freed with the help of American abolitionists in New York City, is particularly one of very few accounts of slave life from the perspective of a slave. Bakwakwa arrived in Pernambuco in the 1840s. In this excerpt, after having recounted the story of his capture, he talks about life aboard a slave ship. Thus he said, "Its horrors, who can describe? None can so truly depict its horrors as the poor, unfortunate, miserable wretch that has been confined within its portals. We were thrust into the hold of the vessel in a state of nudity, the males being crammed on one side and the females on the other. The hold was so low that we could not stand up, but were obliged to crouch upon the floor or sit down. Day and night were the same to us, sleep being denied us from the confined position of our bodies, and we became desperate through suffering and fatigue. Oh, the loathsomeness and filth of that horrible place will never be effaced from my memory. Nay, as long as memory holds her seat in this distracted brain, will I remember that. My heart, even to this day, sickens at the thought of it. The only food we had during the voyage was corn soaked and boiled. I cannot tell how long we were thus confined, but it seemed a very long while. We suffered very much for want of water, but were denied all that we needed. A pint a day was all that was allowed, and no more, and a great many slaves died upon the passage. There was one poor fellow so very desperate for want of water that he attempted to snatch a knife from the white man who brought in the water when he was taken up on deck, and I never knew what became of him. I supposed the man was thrown overboard. When I reached the shore, I felt thankful to Providence that I was once more permitted to breathe pure air, the thought of which almost absorbed every other. I cared but little then that I was a slave. Having escaped the ship was all I thought about. Some of the slaves on board could talk Portuguese. They had been living on the coast with Portuguese families, and they used to interpret to us. They were not placed in the hold with the rest of us, but came down occasionally to tell us something or other. These slaves never knew they were to be sent away until they were placed on board the ship. I remained in this slave market for a day or two, before I was again sold to a slave dealer in the city, who again sold me to a man in the country who was a baker, and resided not a great distance from Pernambuco. When a slaver comes in, the news spreads like wildfire, and down come all those that are interested in the arrival of the vessel with its cargo of living merchandise, who select from the stock those most suited to their different purposes, and purchase the slaves precisely in the same way that oxen or horses would be purchased in a market. But if there are not the kinds of slaves in the one cargo, suited to the wants and wishes of the slave buyers, an order is given to the captain for the particular sorts required, which are furnished to order the next time the ship comes into port. Great numbers make quite a business of this, and do nothing else for a living, depending entirely upon this kind of traffic. By 1888, abolition had the support of most Brazilians, including several conservative sectors, the culmination of a long process of societal and economic changes. By the time slavery was abolished, the practice had already begun to decrease due to the modernization of agriculture and increasing migration towards Brazil's cities from rural areas. Yet the shift took nearly 70 years. Great Britain outlawed slavery in 1807 and subsequently began to pressure other nations to follow suit, including Brazil upon its independence from Portugal. However, in 1822, 1.5 million of 3.5 million people in Brazil were enslaved, and the practice was not simply tolerated, but strongly supported by all segments of society, including the Catholic Church. Even though slavery was formally abolished in 1888, the country's exclusionary institutions, racist social fabric, and myopic national fantasies speak to the persistence of racialized domination to this day. This reality was so buttressed by a deliberate effort at whitening Brazilian society through various state-sponsored immigration projects and frontier colonization plans throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. In spite of the myth of being a racial democracy, Brazil has forged a stratified, unequal citizenship, and everyday life is marked by an ongoing poverty of rights. Scholars in all fields decry the widespread police brutality against black men, a genocide in the making, for example, and the impervious structural violence that impinges on morbidity and disparities in care and mortality among blacks across the country. In closing, confronting the untold horrors of Brazilian slavery necessitates acknowledging the enduring impact on the descendants of those who suffered. It prompts reflection on the collective responsibility to address systemic inequalities and work towards a more just and inclusive society. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Did you learn a thing or two? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comment section. We're eager to hear from you. And kindly remember to support the growth of this channel by leaving a like, share with family and friends, and subscribe if you are yet to. Thank you for watching.